Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time you might happen to be watching this. I'm glad that you've tuned in to watch Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church's Sunday School. And we are glad that you're here. We're looking forward to the day when we can gather together again personally and have Sunday School. But for now, you can watch this anytime that you want. Last week we finished up with the general letters that Paul has written: Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. I say general because they're not about a specific theme as much as the Thessalonian letters. 1st and 2nd Thessalonians is what we will deal with today. They are not that well known in many Christian circles. They're not really something that you often hear sermons from or something like that, but they're very valuable and important letters. These may well be the oldest, particularly 1 Thessalonians, may well be the oldest Christian documents that we have. It's between 1 Thessalonians and 1 Corinthians. Both of them are very early, like 50 to 54, around there, AD. So what exactly was going on at the city of Thessalonica? Remember that in Acts, we get a very explicit sort of feel for what the city of Thessalonica was about. Here is Acts 17, and it's talking about Paul's journey. After they traveled through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a Jewish synagogue. Paul went to the Jews in the synagogue, as he customarily did, and on 3 Sabbath days he addressed them from the Scriptures, explaining and demonstrating that the Christ had to suffer and arise from the dead, saying, "This Jesus I am proclaiming to you is the Christ." Remember that Christ is a title. Christ is not Jesus' last name. It's a title. So Messiah or Messiah in Hebrew is anointed one. Christos in Greek is anointed one. So when Paul says he is the Christ or he is Christ, he is saying that he is the Messiah. And so that's why he says, "This Jesus I am proclaiming to you is the Christ, is the Messiah." Some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, along with a large group of God-fearing Greeks and quite a few prominent women. So we learn from that the church at Thessalonica was really a mixture. It was both Jewish people whom Paul had spoken to at the synagogue, but there were also Greeks and a variety of women, probably with a significant amount of money. That's probably what Paul means by prominent. They had money that they could help support the church. So let's think for a moment about these two letters, neither of them very big. 1 Thessalonians 5 chapters, 2 Thessalonians 3 chapters. Let's look at them together and think about what they have to say to us today. Here's our inevitable cartoon that we have every week, and here we have a thistle and an onion. Thistle, onion is supposed to be Thessalonians, I suppose. The theme is sort of stay on target, to live godly lives, to pursue and persevere what God has told us to do. So this one thistle and one onion are trying desperately to do one thing: stay on target. And that's the key word sort of 1 Thessalonians. You'll now be able to think about, when you hear of it, I hope, them staying on target. The relationship between Paul and the believers at Thessalonica was like a father with his children. If you read through 1 Thessalonians, you will find a number of sort of fatherly or parental kind of things that Paul says. And he tells them that steadfast service and the faith in Jesus Christ and the joy that comes from that are reasons for Paul's commendations of them. He says good things about most of the Thessalonian church at this point. And he urges them to stay the course or to stay on target in order to alleviate fears that those who died before the parousia were not going to eventually be members of the kingdom of God. They were heavily expecting the parousia, or the coming of Christ, at this time. And it will create some problems that we will see in 2 Thessalonians. So, in words, the theme is sort of persevere and live godly lives. Stay on target. Do what God has told you to do. Even though it at times can be difficult, even though it at times can create issues for us, it's our job to persevere and do what God has told us to do. Here's a brief and quick outline of the book. Paul is very, very kind and lauding of the Thessalonians in the first chapter, even through the middle of the third chapter, or mostly the third chapter. You'll see that he's saying, I'm praying for you, I'm proud of you, you've done great things. And then after that, he talks to them about some things concerning the day of the Lord. That is the coming back of the Lord Jesus Christ, or what we might call the second coming. And he tells them to be careful about whom they believe and about what they believe about this second coming. And then he gives them some concluding exhortations that we'll look into more specifically in just a moment. That gives you sort of a brief overview of what the book of 1 Thessalonians is about. It's about eschatology, coming of the Son of Man, and ethics, stay on target. So if we can think of the relationship between eschatology and ethics, it will help us to understand these Thessalonian letters. Often when we talk about eschatology, which comes from the Greek word eschatos, which means last, so it's a study of the last things, many people, when they think about eschatology, the only thing they think about is the second coming of the Lord, the day of the Lord. And yet, eschatology can be both personal and universal. The coming of the day of the Lord is a universal thing, but our own death and what happens to us after our death is eschatological, but it's personally eschatological. And often people don't think about that in terms of eschatology. So it's significant in these two books, particularly, that eschatology and ethics are wound together, and that you don't just go through your life hoping for the day of the Lord. You go through your life doing the right thing with the realization that the Lord himself is coming back at some time to reward those who do the right thing. Then there's a second Thessalonians, shorter book, and this book is about work while you wait. And so you can see here that we have 2 thistles and 2 onions, so 2 Thessalonians. And there's a man who's working, but he's also looking at a scale. So he's working while he checks his weight. And the farmer here is doing what we all should be doing, and that is working. One of the great problems with the Thessalonian church that necessitated the book of 2 Thessalonians, or the letter of 2 Thessalonians, is that some of the people had decided that the day of the Lord could happen anytime. As a result of that, they had quit working and were just trying to get money from other people. So they figured, listen, if the Lord's coming back this week, which it looks like he is in their mind, we don't need to go to work. We'll just get other people to feed us. It's very similar to some of the other people down through the history of Christianity who have claimed that they knew exactly when the Lord was coming and asked their followers to give away everything. Give it to them, of course, and allow them then to take that money and use it. And we've seen this a number of times. People have given away everything they have. The Lord doesn't come back, and then there they are. There have been people who have gone out and maxed out their credit cards thinking that they knew when the Lord was coming and thinking, I'll just buy this, the Lord will come, we won't ever have to pay it. So that kind of thing makes its way into Christianity even today, but it's particularly problematic in in the book of 2 Thessalonians. So 2 Thessalonians is essentially about stand firm and live godly lives while you're waiting for the day of the Lord. It doesn't mean that you suddenly become lazy, that you suddenly don't work, you quit working. It doesn't mean that you suddenly just do whatever you want to. It's important for us to realize that work is a part of God's plan. God has made us to work and to enjoy our work. And so it's critical for us to think through what would cause a person to want not to work. And that's what had happened with the Thessalonian people. That's what has happened with a certain segment of the population today. They don't work, and as a result, they do what some of the Thessalonian people did, and that is to just stand out there asking for money. We see it all the time. Here's a quick outline of 2 Thessalonians. That is the thanksgiving and prayer at the beginning. Paul was still praying for them. The misunderstanding regarding the day of the Lord. This is where we find this famous passage where Paul says, if a person won't work, then neither should he eat. What he means by that is, if you're not willing to work for your own food, then you should go hungry. And he doesn't mean that about somebody who's, handicapped or something like that. But he means a general, relatively good shape person who refuses to work. There's something wrong with them, and they ought not to be allowed to continue on like that. Paul then exhorts them to follow the commands that he has given them, and then gives them a wonderful conclusion. So let's look at some of the critical issues that we see in these two books together. One of the critical issues is authorship. We're moving now into the disputed epistles. That is, epistles that claim to be written by Paul, but that many in modern scholarship today dispute. Now, that's not the case for 1 Thessalonians. Almost no one questions Paul's authorship of 1 Thessalonians. It's 2 Thessalonians where we run into this kind of critical idea. And in 2 Thessalonians, many more questions have been raised. Some see 2 Thessalonians as a correction of the over-realized eschatology brought about by the first letter. It means over-realized eschatology is the idea that God's coming back this week, so let's do whatever we want. We don't know when God is coming back, and Paul very specifically says to the Thessalonians, he's not coming back until these certain things happen, like the great taking away of the parousia and things like that. So these differences between 1 and 2 Thessalonians, there are differences, I don't deny that, but I think that they've been overplayed. And I don't believe there's a compelling reason to believe that Paul didn't write 2 Thessalonians. Paul claims to have signed 2 Thessalonians. You'll notice that he says, I sign this letter with my own hand as I do all my letters. So there was certainly time between 54 AD and 63 AD for Paul to have written this second letter to the Thessalonians, and time for him to have written other letters and to have signed them like that. Here's the passage from 2 Thessalonians 3, very last section. I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand, which is how I write every letter. So you get from that the idea that Paul is making a specific statement about having written it. Otherwise, the person who wrote that down is lying. There has been a movement put forward, or an idea put forward, that this was written by Paul's followers, and they had notes from him, and they put it together into a book. But when you claim that it's written by Paul and that Paul has signed it, it moves from being a piece about building that person up to pure fraud. And I find it very difficult to think that the New Testament writers would have been involved in pure out-and-out fraud, which is what this would have required by saying that. One of the problems, another of the critical problems, is the order of the letters. That is, some have argued that 2 Thessalonians ought to precede 1 Thessalonians. The titles were added later, almost certainly. But there's no reason to think that Paul wrote the second book first. The second book seems very clearly to follow on the first book. The first book talks about the coming of the Lord happening. Be ready for it. The second book talks about what happens when you take that too far and say, well, the Lord's coming, therefore I don't have to work, I don't have to do anything, I can just sponge off other people and live that way. No, don't live that way. There's a famous book that's not in the New Testament, but it's called the Didache, the teaching. And in it there are specific instructions about how long a person could stay at another person's house. So the Didache says something like, if a person stays at your house for more than 5 days, he's a false prophet. And what they mean by that is that there apparently were some people who came along saying they were prophets of God, wanting to stay and take advantage of Christian hospitality, but they just really didn't do anything. And so the fact that the letters are in the proper order, I think, is without question. In terms of the date, conservative scholars date the letter pretty early, 51, some 52 to 53. Some critics have dated the second letter much, much later, like into the 90s. And of course, if the second letter is dated into the 90s, then it can't be written by Paul. It has to be written by somebody else. So I don't find that compelling. I find there was some time between the two letters, but I don't know exactly how much. And certainly, if the first letter was written in the early 50s and the second letter was written in the 60s, early 60s, and that's plenty of time in between the two letters for these kinds of things to develop. What about the city? Thessalonica was one of the major cities in the Roman Empire. It was on the sea. It had a great deal of things that were happening in the city. A great deal of work was going on. And the church was apparently started by Paul and composed of both Jews and Gentiles. We remember that passage from Acts that we read just a little bit earlier, where it was said that Paul went to the synagogue. And when people believed his message about the Messiah, they started their own church, and there were both Jews and Greeks there. So it's likely that Paul met and preached the gospel to the Gentiles in the context of his job as a tent maker. Remember that Paul didn't want to owe these people to whom he was a missionary. He didn't want to owe them anything. He didn't want to take money from them or housing from them. And so he had a job. And in 1 Thessalonians 2:9, Paul talks about this job. He says, "For you recall, brothers and sisters, our toil and drudgery, by working night and day, so as not to impose a burden on any of you. We preach to you the gospel of God." So he was working hard and preaching as much as he could. And that's the reason that he says working night and day, so that he didn't place a burden on any of them, so that he didn't create issues for any of them or ask them for money. The message of the books is really composed, as I've already mentioned, of these two strong themes: ethics and eschatology. Ethics and eschatology are inevitably linked in the New Testament. The fact that we are waiting for the coming of the Lord tells us how we ought to act in our everyday life. Here's an example from chapter 4 and verse 11. "Aspire to lead a quiet life, to attend to your own business, and to work with your hands, as we commanded you. In this way, you will live a decent life before outsiders and not be in need." Not being in need means you don't have to go to someone else and ask them for their material or money or housing. And you are doing that because you are working. Work with your hands. And so there is certainly in the text of both the Thessalonian epistles, there's certainly this idea that everyone ought to take care of themselves. They ought to work for themselves. They ought not to just ask for money for someone else or from someone else. In terms of eschatology, the preaching of Paul had apparently been taken to an extreme by some members of the community. And in 2 Thessalonians 2 is a place where we see this most clearly acted out. Paul is saying the Lord could come back at any time, and they are saying, well, that's great. Let's just party on because we don't have to do anything. That was very seriously a flawed idea of what Paul was really saying, and that's the reason that he has to write such a strong rebuke to them in 2 Thessalonians, particularly in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. The book includes statements about a variety of eschatological topics. The most obvious one is the coming of Christ. I mean, clearly in 1 Thessalonians 4, Paul talks about the coming of the Lord. And I'll take just a second to say that not everyone who is a Christian believes in what might be termed the secret rapture. Some believe that there will be some sort of a secret rapture in which only Christians are taken up, and there's 3.5 or 7 years of tribulation. Others believe that that's not what is being spoken of. It's not a secret rapture that's being spoken of in the Thessalonian epistles. There's nothing secret about it. There are trumpets blowing, there are angels coming, there's noise, and there's movement, and there's all kinds of things. So I do not believe myself that we are waiting for the rapture. I believe that we are waiting for the coming of the Lord. And if you read through 1 Thessalonians 4, you'll begin to see that this is not talking about some secret kind of action. This is very, very obvious that everyone would know about it. He also talks to us about the man of lawlessness in 2 Thessalonians 2. This is one of the most difficult passages in the entire New Testament. If you were to look this up in scholarly literature, you would find 13 to 15 different alternatives about who and what the man of lawlessness is. And so you would have to somehow sort through all that. The problem is the use of the term mystery and the use of the term man of lawlessness. We're really trying hard to look at the background, to look at the context, and figure out what is it that Paul is saying about this man of lawlessness. Who is the man of lawlessness? What is he doing to come? There has been this idea that if there's a rapture and if there's a tribulation, that the man of lawlessness comes and destroys everything during the tribulation. I don't think that that's quite the case, but you can study this on your own because it's a passage that is well worth studying. There are lots and lots of different ideas about what it means. Then there's also the removal of the restrainer. So the reason that Paul is saying this is he wants the Thessalonian people to recognize that they're not, the Lord is not going to come today without anything happening before it. He said the man of lawlessness must come before the Lord comes, and the removal of the restrainer must happen before the Lord comes. So those are two things that hadn't happened at the time of 2 Thessalonians, and as a result, Paul is saying to them, this is important. You've got to sort through this, because if you don't, then you're going to get yourself into a variety of different problems, much like the problem that you're having right now with some of the members of the church not working and just asking other Christians for money. Here's 2 Thessalonians 2:1 and following, where Paul talks about this. Now, regarding the arrival of our Lord Jesus Christ and our being gathered to be with him, we ask you, brothers and sisters, not to be easily shaken from your composure or disturbed by any kind of spirit or message or letter allegedly from us. Another little hint that Paul actually writes this letter, because there were fraudulent letters going around. To the effect, a letter from us to the effect that the day of the Lord is already here. Let no one deceive you in any way, for that day will not arrive until the rebellion comes and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction. So that's a very difficult. Apparently, one of the problems in reading New Testament letters is that we're almost hearing one side of a phone call. You hear what Paul is saying, but you don't know what the Thessalonians already knew. They knew, apparently, whom Paul meant by the man of lawlessness, but we don't, unfortunately, we don't have a clear and concise and absolute knowledge of what he was talking about or who he was talking about. So we're wrestling with it. Scholars are constantly wrestling with it. Paul talks not only about eschatology, but also about ethics. The book has a variety, both the books, both the letters have a variety of statements about ethical topics. So there, Paul speaks in 1 Thessalonians about sexuality. He speaks about love and the way that we ought to display love. He admonishes them to do the right thing and to live a life that would be pleasing to the Lord Jesus Christ. Again, he admonishes them to work. That is, if you're not going to work, then you don't deserve to be fed, clothed, and housed. You're not a little baby anymore. You're an adult, and so you need to work so that you can take care of yourself. And so the proper the prospect of the second coming of Christ is not just a hope for a future life. That's what most people think of when they think of the second coming. They think of the hope for a future life. But this is also a fundamental motivation for right living in the present. Paul is saying to us the reason that we ought to live correctly is because we are Christians and we know that the Lord is coming back and we want to be the kind of witnesses for him that we can. I hope this flyover of the 2 Thessalonian epistles is helpful to you. Next week, we will begin what are called the pastoral epistles. That is, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus are all the pastoral epistles. And we'll take some time to unpack them because there are some really interesting things that are going on there in the pastoral epistles about who can be an elder and who can't and all sorts of things like that. So I hope that this is helpful. I will look forward to seeing you next week as we talk about the pastoral epistles, particularly 1 Timothy next week. Until then, may the Lord bless you through his word. If you read through 1 and 2 Thessalonians this week, think about what the coming of the Lord means and how that ought to affect the way that we live today. So until next week, from Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church Sunday School, I hope that you have a wonderful, blessed week. Thanks so much.